Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's really wonderful to see all of you here, and also to all of the people that are joining us via Zoom. My name is Andrea Ballestero. I'm an associate professor of anthropology here at USC, and I also direct the Ethnography studio. And I do so with the leadership, brilliance, and savviness of Katie Ulrich, who's here, who's the studio coordinator. And I want to ask for them for the work that they do. And I just want to begin by saying that today is an auspicious day for me because we are holding our first annual ethnographic salon here at USC. And we're lucky to have a group of generous and inspiring colleagues join us, and I will introduce them in a little bit of time, but also a group of amazing students with whom I've been working for this semester. I'm very energized by the work that they have done and take this first salon as a symbol of all of the good things that are coming for us here at USC. So thank you to all of you for being here and sharing this with us. So the work that we have done this semester has been in conversation with the Infrastructures of Ethnography project that includes colleagues at Concordia University, the University of Toronto, the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, the University of Pennsylvania, and here at USC. So I know that many of our sister labs, center, studio spaces are connecting via Zoom, so I just want to say hello to all of them.
They're waving.
They're waving, great. So today we have a full agenda. We will begin with a short video that the students have produced capturing their work, and then we'll start a roundtable. So I will first introduce the video, say a couple of things of what we've been doing. So this semester, we collectively explored the concept of porosities. 5 PhD students, Suklin To, Grace Simbalan, Brody Quinn, Katie Ulrich, and Rachel Howard, and also a postdoctoral scholar, Eduardo Yanderas, and I met regularly during the semester to workshop projects or to co-work online. So we did both things, very active, engaged meetings, but also meetings where we worked independently but connected online. Additionally, my collaborator, Nick Bauk, who's here, has been part of the project. He is a geographer and artist, and with him, I have endeavored in a photographic exploration of porosity that you won't be hearing so much about today because today is about student work, but we are going to find other ways of sharing that work with you. So the objective of this semester was twofold, or we had two objectives would be a better way to say. First, we wanted to ask how porosities might help studio members learn new things about their own research projects. And second, we wanted to work through a multimodal object. And here it's important for me to emphasize that this multimodal object, in some instances, it's digital, but it's also analog. And these objects were intended to help us in our thinking. So those objects became prototypes, thinking aids, or also more completed representations of the work that students have been doing. And we will show in a moment a short video that presents a very summarized version of those objects, but I really want to emphasize that the objective of the exercise or the intention was to think through these multimodal objects and not necessarily conceive of those as the final representation of a completed research project. So we were really interested in what happens before you have the completed research project. Even if I'm not sure there is a completed research project, but at least before you present results to others. So to begin this afternoon session, we will show you those objects through a 14-minute video that brings the pieces together and has been put together and edited by Grace Simbalan and Brody Quinn, to whom I thank in advance. So let's start with the video.
Hi, my name is Katie Ulrich, and I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at Rice University. And I've been working with the Ethnography studio at USC this semester. And for the Salon concept of porosities this year, I've created this graph that I'm calling porous transformations. And while porosity, I think, is really helpful for immediately thinking about different kinds of materialities. For me, I was really excited to use porosity to think about relationships between concepts and ideas. So this graph basically takes on the axes here a few different concepts and themes that I'm working with in my research. And graphs are visualizes how these concepts are related to each other. And the darker blue areas represent more kind of porous overlaps, right? Where there is more of a relationship between these themes. So overall, porosity was really helpful for me for thinking about, relationships of figure, ground, and overlap when it came to concepts and ideas within my research. And while this was the kind of first visualization I made, and it functioned really well as a heuristic for my thinking, but I also was interested in making some kind of visualization of my data that other people could engage with more interactively. So I ended up making this other kind of map. And the link, this is a Miro board, it's interactive, you can zoom in and look at the different objects and pictures and read different captions for them, and even follow a little kind of narrative with links that'll walk you through it if you want more structured engagement. So yeah, a link to this Miro board will be made available. But basically, not only did the concept of porosities and the first graph I showed help me make this chart in terms of understanding where some of these different objects and ideas should belong in relationship to others. It's also now exciting to look at it and see porosity in this, right? And see different densities of certain items and, less dense other areas. And so porosity in terms of a way to think through different kinds of conceptual relationships continues to be helpful for me. And I'm interested to hear people's experiences of kind of walking through this map. So definitely check it out and let me know.
Okay, this is the bowl that I made out of paper mache for my Porosities project. I made it out of the ethnographic anecdotes that I wrote about the Roosevelt Dam and about my archival research that I conducted on the Salt River Project. So I created this bowl out of strips of paper that I tore from the ethnographic descriptions, archival materials, and photographs that I took from the water system. There's my dog. You can see still some of the words from my ethnographic anecdotes, but you can also see that the ink has run quite a lot. You do get this like really nice blue that comes out of the photos, and you can also see some words still. And I think this is really evocative. The security fence, the photo of the security fence by the CAP canal is still possible to see. You can see my writing still. And I think it's very cool how the ink has run, so it still has this kind of like blue, evocative water under a kind of like stormy sky feel to it. So that's it. That's the bowl.
And the community does handle a lot of things. They don't want to call the police, but there's like a standing thing, don't call the police. And they will handle themselves. They've actually got together and went to camps and made people leave Slab City. They've done that before. Sometimes it gets physical and stuff like that. But sometimes things need to be done.
if there's some penalties going on, like some, how should we say, illegal stuff going on that maybe you're disrespecting a person in your camp or in another camp, and you can't seem to settle the feud, sometimes there is an event where they get burned out. Maybe they won't leave, and there's a group of people that all decide that the group is correct without a trial. The trial is the elders and the people going on, like they try to get to both sides of the story either way, so I know that the approach is correct. They try to get to the truth. And sometimes either one or both parties don't agree to the truth. Usually the truth lies somewhere in between. And there's events that go on that they just get burned out. Who does it? I don't know. I don't personally you don't hear people say, I burned them out. Some fires happen by accident. But when there's a burnout, something's going on between some camps, some individuals in those camps. They can't seem to work it out with communication. So they take the law in their own hands, which is deadly. It's not right. Getting to the truth is right. How we handle that truth and the consequences behind it is precarious at best.
Master intensity, the transductive effects of timber buoyancy in Peru's tropical timber supply chains, by Eduardo Romero Yenderas. In this video, I focus not as much on porosity per se, but on a concept that, in my view, produces analytically similar effects in pointing us to the internal non-homogeneity of matter and its unexpected historical and political consequences. Density. Drawing on my long-term fieldwork in Peru's Amazonian region of Loreto, I show how the disparate concentrations of wooden matter within different tree species have inflected the course of Loreto's tropical logging industry over the last few decades. I contend that the density of wood, the given ratio of wooden mass to volume in any given particular wooden body, constitutes a transductive force that has historically conditioned the rhythms, frictions, and crafts involved in the labor of harvesting and transporting logs out of the rainforest and into the regional sawmills where timber is to be processed. If transduction is the process by which a signal can move from one domain to the other, producing analogous variations across heterogeneous mediums, I suggest that the density of wood in Loreto's tropical logging industry constitutes a transductive reverberating force through which microscopic distributions of wooden matter can make themselves felt across time and space, from the intimate bodily attunements cultivated by loggers spurring timber out of the rainforest to the historical cycles of contraction and expansion of Loreto's tropical timber supply chains. By focusing on Loreto, where water constitutes the dominant medium of circulation, I show how the buoyancy of timber, largely a physical function of its relative density vis-a-vis water, becomes the force that has historically determined the conditions by which wooden matter enters tropical timber supply chains. As timber buoyancy articulates the subtle craftsmanship of loggers, as it temporally organizes the industrial periodicity of timber harvesting and transportation, and as it partially informs the historical cycles of expansion and contraction of the tropical timber industry in the rainforest, I thus show how the non-homogeneity of wooden matter animates the economic and environmental worlds of Loreto in significant and sometimes unexpected ways.
This is an attempt to create a visual beyond just coding, as I understand that code is not legible to most people, and neither is debugging and data processing. So I was trying to capture the idea of a partial seeing, of you're able to see enough to see some go through and understand more or less the flow, but there's still a lot of blockages happening. So you can only see through a partial seeing. And the reason why I tried to do more than one of these layers is because it's the process of data processing and debugging and code in general is that you do things portion by portion. So you can see up to a certain point, you move on to the next section, you see until a certain point, you see until a certain point. So you can, it's only transparent to a point, or you can only see up to a point, and you're not actually able to see through completely the whole way, but only by piece, and you kind of have to piece together something. So trying to capture this idea of like a partial seeing, this idea or this visual came together from thinking about like the Swiss, like literal porous materials, but literally the idea came from the Swiss cheese model of like preventing pandemics. Yeah, it's not that artistic, but I just felt like code was inaccessible.
Hi, my name is Grace Mbulan, a first-year PhD student in anthropology at USC. So for my Porosities project, I constructed a maze-like piece using ropes, cork tiles, and other materials. I used ropes to form the walls of the piece, cork tiles to form the base, and patches of grass-like materials in different hues of green to cover the various elements. Despite appearing to be an empty space, the maze is actually filled with assorted objects concealed beneath patches of grass-like materials. These objects include elements found in the mines, ranging from literal elements such as gold, skulls, and other materials, as well as male figures covered in transcripts of interviews with my interlocutors. The piece illustrates how hollowed-out spaces are neither empty nor meaningless. By closely examining these spaces, one can cover a multitude of lively engagements, encounters, and relationships, not only between miners, but also between human and non-human beings that inhabit these spaces. I approach hollowed-out spaces in a similar fashion to how Macarena Gomez-Bariz examines microspaces, or zones of catastrophe in extractive zones. She defines extractive zones as spaces traversed by colonialism and extractive capitalism, which continue to leave a deep imprint in these geographies. Instead of equating the act of hollowing out to emptying that focuses solely on the colonial conditions of these spaces, I suggest that we pay close attention to the microspaces within these extractive zones and highlight submerged perspectives to challenge the totalizing view of no future, defined as the inevitability of the anthropogenic-led collapse of the planet and its ecologies.
Okay, so please join me in thanking our students. So now we'll move on to the second part of our salon today, which is our roundtable. And I'm going to begin by introducing our guests. Professor Alina Kim from UC Irvine is a cultural anthropologist whose research grapples with ideas of nature and culture, the biological and the social, in the production of personhood and social value. Her work includes the examination of transnational adoption from South Korea, the ecologies of the demilitarized zone, and transnational circulations of medicinal ginseng. Professor Kim explores how conceptions of nation, personhood, politics, and non-human relations are performatively and discursively made. Professor Teresa Montoya is a Diné social scientist and media producer at the University of Chicago, whose work focuses on problems of sovereignty and toxic contamination in relation to legacies of land dispossession and resource extraction across the indigenous Southwest. Her work integrates Diné oral histories and ethnography to analyze ongoing environmental and legal impacts for Diné communities following toxic events across the Navajo Nation. She's developing the concept of permeability to reimagine how settler territorial regimes and violence, contemporary environmental regulation, gender political mobilization, and public health shape each other. Professor Gabriela Soto Laveaga is a historian of science at Harvard University. Her research and teaching interests include modern Latin America, the intersection of science and culture, public health, and scientific and medical exchange in the Global South. She's completing a project that examines the role of healthcare providers as both critical actors in the formation of modern states and as social agitators. And another project that narrates 20th century agriculture development aid from the point of view of India and Mexico. Broadly, she's interested in how distribution of and disputes over land and water, as well as ethnic tensions among farmers, influenced the location and objectives of scientific practice. So welcome very much to the Ethnography Studio and to USC. And I have prepared a few questions to get us started. We'll reserve some time at the end for questions from you or comments, and also from our friends and colleagues that are joining via Zoom. So to begin, I wanted to ask the three of you if you could tell us a little bit about your recent research or an ongoing project that you're working on, but particularly if you could emphasize some dimension, component, or element that is giving you particular joy or particular fulfillment at the moment. Do you want to start over there?
Sure, I can start. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. We had such a fun first half of the day. So it's really nice to be able to continue the conversation in a more public setting. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Katie, and everyone else. So the things that are giving me joy. I actually, when I was thinking about this, I was like, I think the thing that's giving me joy now is because my second book on the Korean demilitarized zones ecologies came out recently, so I've been fortunate to give talks, etc. And it's been interesting to see a growing intellectual engagement with and concern over what we might call critical militarisms or demilitarized ecologies or ecologies of war. And Teresa and I also has, she's been involved in a collaboration that I was working on with Bridget Gorshi, who's at Franklin and Marshall, and trying to sort of think differently about both the frames of war and the frames of ecology that I think could use some more deeply ethnographic and relational treatment. So thinking about how those two things come together always in a sense, and particularly in the context of perpetual war. Obviously we're in Ukraine, but obviously many other battlefields and wars around the world that continue to be active. So I don't know if it gives me joy, but I'm glad that there's more, there seems to be a growing kind of momentum around this conversation. So I'll put it that way. Yeah. Okay.
It's a hard question to answer. Yes, and thank you, Andrea, for bringing us all together. Yeah, we had such a engaging discussion this morning. I guess in terms of joy, as someone who's very early career, so I just finished, my postdoc. I'm on my first year of my tenure track right now, and I spent a lot of my postdoc during COVID, trying to forge collaborations on the internet or in Zoom spaces, and being trained in anthropology. I think we're very much still a single author discipline. So I've been trying to kind of push the conventions of that sort of model in my own work, and try to strike a balance between what I'm doing, ethnographically, but also to be learning from other disciplines. So I've been collaborating with a lot of folks in writing, particularly in cultural geography, which I think actually has a lot of interesting things happening in regards to questions around Indigenous land status. So I've been attending, American Association of Geographers. I've also found a lot of interesting overlaps in my work in environmental history. And these spaces sometimes can be jarring because they're talking about things differently than I was trained, but it's also been very refreshing to re-articulate some of my concerns into other disciplines. And beyond that, in terms of my attempt to translate my work to broader audiences, I'm also a curator. So that's something that has always given me joy. And we were talking at lunch how when I did my PhD, I actually wanted to be a curator. I was really interested in like native art, and I realized that I needed a PhD if I wanted to be able to do research in a museum context. And, you know, of course, along the way, I became really interested in more political questions, but I've always maintained an interest in museum spaces as a place that most people, this might be their only way that they engage with Indigenous objects or Indigenous culture. So I recently just completed a project at the Field Museum last year, which was basically over 100 guest curators, Indigenous guest curators, where we reconceptualized the Indigenous galleries in that very colonial space. So that has given me a lot of joy. I mean, it was a difficult process, but I feel like that work will probably be seen by more people than anything I ever write in an academic venue. So yeah, I think that those sorts of things, pushing myself beyond, I guess, traditional single authorship has been something compelling for me.
So I think I want to echo what my colleagues have said, that this morning was just such a generative space. You saw what the grad students created, and it was really remarkable to be able to be in dialogue with them. So thank you, Andrea, for that opportunity, and Katie for organizing. And thank you so much for those of you who were present this morning. So recently, I love that question about what has recently given, it sparked joy in my research. And I had an immediate reaction. Last month, I was able to interview a retired ethnobotanist in Mexico City who is incredibly modest about what she accomplished in her long career. She was the director of the Medicinal and Toxic Plants Herbarium in Mexico City, which is located in the basement of one of the largest hospitals in Mexico City. And from this rather small space, she redefined what ethnobotany was of medicinal and toxic plants. And she received late in life all of these recognitions. And for a long time, I had been wanting to write her story and to place her within conversation of scientific production in Mexico. And someone who, as a female, now retired, who was often considered on the fringes of scientific production in mid-20th century Mexico, to capture her story. So last 3 weeks ago, I spent 3 days, 5 hours each, just recording her story. And it was beyond what I expected. So that has given me incredible joy to be able to record and to work with her to tell her story, insert it into something differently. And with regard to my current work, as Andrea said, I'm finishing this book that's re-narrating the Green Revolution. So for those of you who are familiar with the Green Revolution, it follows the same narrative regardless of when this story is produced. And I started to question the start point of 1943. So a few years ago, I wrote an article about what if we did microhistories of the Green Revolution and not this macro history with this hero, Norman Borlaug, at the center of the story, American technocrats and American aid going to save the global South. What if instead, as a historian, I could delve deep, burrow into two spaces, not just one, and not make it a comparison, because I'm not interested in comparative histories. You can't compare India and Mexico, which is what I'm doing, but rather two microhistories that could dialogue with each other and be tethered by an event that otherwise would not have put these two locations in conversation with each other. So I write this article, and I said in order to do that, we needed to look at what I called largo dislocare, dislocate the histories, but also look beyond the bookends of history that had been used. And that methodology allowed me to begin to look at spaces that were in some ways transformed by agro-technologies of the mid-20th century, but not how we expected. So hopefully I'll finish that this time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that we find space to talk about the things that we like about what we do, because usually there's, plenty of things that we don't like so much about what we do, but there are these things that if we spend more time thinking about them can spark all of these new directions for work and collaboration. So maybe now we can get into the concept of porosity. And my first question refers to the idea that the notion of porous borders has been mobilized by national and right-wing projects to speak of so-called security breaches and failures of the state to secure its boundaries. So grounded on racist tropes and militarized understandings of sovereignty, the porous border has emerged into something of a cultural figure of the troubled and violent times that we live in. But the question that I have is a little bit speculative. I am interested in how would you redo the notion of the porous border? How would you redefine the porous border based on your own research? And whether there are any examples of porous borders that are generative and that you find in your own fieldwork and historical materials that you've been working with. So could we start here on this side?
Yeah, absolutely. I really love this question. And to redefine it, and the first thing I thought of when I read the question, because we often think about borders as spaces where movement stops, where roads end, and where people are halted. But the image of a border, this image of a border has become associated in some ways with rigidity, inflexibility, and barriers to both movement, but also to thought. So when I read this question, the first thing I thought of was scholars who are working on roads that lead to borders and have to be stopped. It turns out that the roads end because there's now a national or international border, but other non-human beings find ways to continue on the road. So this was the image when I was thinking about how could we rethink this notion of porosity and using this border image of roads that feel as if they've been stopped, but if you look at a different level, either a micro level, or if you look differently, movement is still continuing. So it's a perception of stopping, but it's actually some beings continue to go through. So, and it reminded me in my own work, I've written about rogue seeds because I work with looking at experimental stations and seeds that aren't meant to be where they're supposed to be, or seeds that because of the wind or contamination or some other aspect, seeds find their way into plots where they shouldn't be. And it's really important that they not be there because these are plots that are being examined. So for me, porosity is about these rogue seeds or living things that manage to make their way into spaces in where they will disrupt, in this case, an experiment, but they disrupt life. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because we have other varieties that can emerge from this coming together of seeds. So I think for me, thinking about porosity with my own work made me think of seeds being where they're not meant to be, but not always in a bad way.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as we were discussing earlier, so, the analytic that I'm developing in my work is permeability, which actually I, contemplated the notion of porosity for a while before landing on permeability. And it does temporal and geographic work. So I'm really trying to spatialize sovereignty, in particular in the Navajo Nation, or what I'm saying in and between the Navajo Nation. So I'm interested in these spaces that are not part of the status quo jurisdiction of tribal land bases. And this is as a consequence of different sorts of settler territorial regimes like railroad allotments, which led to what's called checkerboard patterning. So it was through cartography, right, as a colonial enterprise that arrived to Dene homelands in the mid-19th century that I had this idea of permeability, that the settler territorial regime had permeated our Dene homelands. So that analytic actually emerged as a visual representation, right? And the way I'm imagining it is also, it works both ways. It's a technique of dispossession of Dene sovereignty to, enact environmental governance, to remediate, what I'm looking at, uranium spills. But also it offers a space of possibility where Dene actors are able to move in between different jurisdictions, tribal, state, county, federal. So there's something there that I think is redemptive and not just foreclosing. And so that's what I'm interested in terms of permeability. To bring it back specifically to security breaches and failure of state, and I guess the militarized notion of porosity that you're inviting us to think with, as I'm reminded of what I've looked at in the archives in terms of these letters written by settlers to colonial officials in like the mid 19th century, where they were worried about Indians going off the reservation. And this is actually something that a racialized idea that persists to this day in reservation border towns. When I think of border, I actually think of border towns. And it's in those spaces that you have the most heightened sense of racial violence. And these are places that are on the fringes of tribal reservations. There's usually, predatory lenders and automobile auto sellers, and Gallup, New Mexico, for instance, which is located right on the edge of the Navajo Nation, has like the highest per capita of liquor stores and bars. And also, I think the highest grossing Walmart in the United States. And because Navajo Nation is a so-called food desert, I think it only has 13 grocery stores across a space that is equivalent to the size of West Virginia. Every weekend is like an exodus from the reservation, where Dene people have to drive to reservation border towns to buy groceries. So those are very extractive spaces, and they're very racially violent. So I think borders and border towns are an interesting place to see kind of the most extreme form of that, I guess, colonial violence that persists.
Hard to go last. There's so much, interesting stuff to process. But thank you for this question. It's really certainly relevant to a lot of my work, particularly, because the Korean demilitarized zone is in some, verbiage like the scariest place on earth. It's like one of the most impervious borders in the world. Trump himself went there and said, this is a real wall. So a real border, I should say, thinking about the wall, obviously. But I think what it suggests is two things about borders, is that borders proliferate other borders in the sense of different kinds of violence, as you mentioned with border towns. It proliferates different kinds of networks of power, imperialisms, and sovereign violence or sovereign regimes. But I would also say that, if for anyone who studies borders, they're always incredibly porous. Like, you cannot create an impervious border. And border maintenance is a huge thing. Like, doing an ethnography of borders requires one to understand all the mechanisms by which, the human construction of these borders fails a lot of times. So even with the DMZ, this is I shouldn't say it's funny, but it's interesting. There was a case in which, there are these guard posts all over, and soldiers are manning them at all hours. And so there was a case of these South Korean soldiers in a guard post, and suddenly there's a knock on the door. And it was like a Korean soldier that wanted to defect, but they had no idea that he was coming. It's like there's just this sense that whatever impermeability we may attribute to borders, there's a kind of inherent porousness to them, precisely because they're socially constructed. But as far as how to think about that fact, one thing that I write about in my book is the book's organized around like 3 different infrastructures that conceptually, I argue, kind of intervene into dominant discourses about the Korean national division and the sort of conventional geopolitical frames. But none of these infrastructures, which are kind of, maybe we could say, performances of permeability or porosity, are you know, symbolic or inherently about freedom, right? They're always kind of fraught with power. So I want to sort of, you know, I think there's a way in anthropology today where when we think about power and different structures of power, we like to see the transgression built into it, but it's not necessarily that, right? It's something else. It's not completely impermeable, but the permeability doesn't mean that it's free or the opposite. So I think there's something about the heterogeneity that is really important to attend to. And the last thing I'll say, because rogue seeds is so great, because I also talk about landmines as rogue infrastructure. And when I was developing that project, someone I spoke with said, "Oh, they're kind of like seeds." And you know, because the quality of mines is that they can travel, right? They get carried not by wind but by water, and you know, their life is indeterminate because you don't know how long they're going to be active. So anyways, this is just a kind of interesting overlap there, but yeah, thank you for the provocation.
So rogue seeds, rogue infrastructures. I love the notion of redemptive borders, but also thank you for emphasizing the proliferation of borders, out of borders, through the image of the border town. I think that's a really powerful way to think about this. Now, I want us to move maybe from the body politic to human or biological bodies. And porosity has been used to highlight the openness of the flesh in a certain way, while earlier conceptualizations of the porous self were used to challenge the modern liberal ideas of bounded individuals. Today, seems to me at least, porosity seems to take a more material meaning, and perhaps not surprising given the environmental crisis, concerns, challenges that we're experiencing. So it seems that the contemporary porous human or porous body is one open to the comings and goings of materials across membranes, across lungs, across skin. So furthermore, this understanding now also encompasses more than human beings. So I'm interested in your research. How do people think of porous bodies? How do they relate to the circulation of toxins, pollution, and ultimately harm? And do people think of those vulnerabilities in terms of porosities or through other concepts? So yeah, so maybe should we begin with you, Elena?
I'm not sure, I've been thinking about this. I'm not sure how I can ground it in my research, but or I can ground it in sort of a developing project. So in a project I'm kind of, it's information with a medical anthropologist, Elise Andaya, we're working on a collaborative project on smell, particularly in a post-COVID moment. And so, you know, smell obviously, you know, is all about porousness, you know, and how outsides come inside, and then what happens with our ability to sense the outside, but also interpret things like toxins, right? And so, you know, I've been through that project just ruminating on sort of the ways that, I mean, one thing that we talk about is the history of the sense of smell, which has always been considered like the most base, like the most animal, and therefore the least sophisticated and the least trustworthy in some ways. But we see all these examples in our contemporary moment where smell is, I'm thinking of the explosion in Ohio of the train that got derailed and, you know, all the chemical spills. And it was really telling how when news media went there, you know, they were told that EPA officials were saying, oh, it's perfectly safe, right? All of the levels of toxic chemicals are at a level that's below the threshold of endangerment. But all of the residents were saying, how could you possibly say that? We can smell it everywhere. So there's this kind of disjunction between the sort of fleshly, sensorial, sensuous experience and the ways that certain kinds of expertise produce knowledge about, in this case, what's safe and what's toxic, but also in terms of what is, legitimate knowledge and what is illegitimate knowledge. So I'm not sure that that connects necessarily to porosity, but it helps me think through just different mediations of illness and wellness. And so thank you. I guess I don't know if this contributed much, but anyways, good to think with. So.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up thresholds, because I've been thinking a lot. I mean, that's kind of a boundary, right? It marks like a regulatory boundary. So in my work, I'm looking at water contamination, particularly primarily of uranium, but also other forms of mining contamination. So like arsenic, cadmium, other things that shouldn't be in your drinking water. And it's really interesting to study, unsurprisingly, the history of environmental regulation, and particularly around, recreational use versus drinking water use, and the different standards that are allowable. And, a lot of scholars who look at this history critically, rightly show how this is not to get rid of pollution in our environments, but merely to regulate an allowable presence of pollution. And here I'm thinking about Max Lieberman's excellent book, Pollution is Colonialism. And so I've been thinking a lot about that in relation to, jurisdictional boundaries, meaning the Navajo Nation's ability to regulate or not particular contaminants in its water, and then thinking in relation to the literal presence of contamination in our groundwater as a consequence of either Cold War era munitions production, which led to over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation, which continue to permeate our groundwater resources. And then even kind of the haunting specter of the potential reactivation of uranium mining across the indigenous Southwest. And there's also different exposure pathways that aren't readily considered. So I think if we're thinking about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, so stemming from the Nevada test site, and then the test bombs in New Mexico, all of that fallout went across the Southwest. So a lot of folks who were living in the area at that time are able to try to secure compensation for various forms of cancer. So I give the example of one Dene man who, per RECA, was able to have his cancer treatment recognized in his throat. However, he later developed kidney cancer, but that was not recognizable or legible to the state. And so there's a partitioning of the body in a way. There's a partitioning of geographic space, a contaminated space, and the secondary cancer in his kidneys is actually causally linked to the ingestion pathway of uranium water. But that's not as easy to recognize, versus what is legible is the inhalation pathway or exposure pathway of inhalation, which would be like a uranium mine worker. So I'm constantly thinking about, thresholds of toxicity within the body and also on the land, and how it seems very arbitrary of what things are recognizable or not. And at the end of the day, it's to accommodate industry. And indigenous lands have continually been made sacrifice zones for these multiple forms of extraction, and the evidence is in our bodies. So it's a daunting task to try to identify those things. So some of the collaborations I'm doing right now is working with hydrologists. So I'm going to be going back home to Navajo Nation next week to be collecting some water samples to try to definitively link the Church Rock contamination spill site to Sanders community, which is where my family is from. Because without the physical isotope connection of the uranium, we can't definitively prove that this spill that happened in 1979 is leading to exceedances of groundwater contamination in this community, even though so many people have cancer.
Thank you. So thank you for that question. Thank you for those really wonderful answers. When I first heard your question, so this next project that I'm working on is about groundwater contamination in and around this experimental station that I've been talking about. Because the experiments that have been going on for several decades, over 60 years, what has happened is the overuse of fertilizer that has made its way into groundwater and has contaminated not just the groundwater, but has been run off into the Sea of Cortez. So speaking about the non-human animals, the Sea of Cortez is one of the richest marine spaces on Earth. But when you have this runoff of nitrogen heavy fertilizer going into these spaces, you have these algae blooms that choke off oxygen that lead to life. So I thought I would look at this non-human life, but also close by is the Yaqui territory. And the Yaquis have a rather significant percentage of more cancers than do the white population in the Yaqui Valley. And a big part of it is linked to the type of farming that was being done and the spaces in which they were pushed into. So when I thought about porous bodies, I thought this is what I'm going to be working on. In particular, one of the farming methods, which was using heavy fertilizers before planting the seeds, which in the heat of the Sonoran Desert, which is coming there, with nothing to hold it in, you would have this massive greenhouse effect. And I think it's the top 10, it's in the 10th of the top 10 major greenhouse polluters in the world. So this space here. So 3 weeks ago, I was interviewing a Yaqui water activist, and I wanted to know about cancer rates in his particular tribe. And he kept saying, no, Gabriela, you're missing the point. And I was like, but I have these numbers here. I have these percentages. And he said, let me show you what happened today in my tribe. And he puts this recording that was 2 minutes long and played the entire 2 minutes. And it was cartels that were fighting for the territory that goes through the Yaqui territory. And it was for two minutes. It was just guns going off. And he says, this is our main concern right now. Says this is to talk about porous bodies. It's about violence that is created by this control of territory in a very different way. That's a different type of colonization, because what is being sought out is a corridor for the passage of drugs, in which the state is not coming into these spaces to offer protection or solutions because there's so many different hotspots. So to reconceptualize, when we talk about the dangers of the body and what's coming here, I had thought of toxins and toxic air. I had not considered bullets as being able to pass through skin. And so I'm reconceptualizing what type of violences these are.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that comment reminds us of the need to maybe be precise about the temporal scales through which we think about questions such as porosity, the tendency to a longer time scale, chronic, slow processes, and sometimes these violent eruptions fall off the radar from these kind of conceptual questions, not from the lives and everyday experiences of people, of course. The three of you have spoken a little bit about this next question that I had, but I'm nevertheless going to pose it. And this next question is about knowledge forms or epistemic disputes. So one thing that I've learned in my own research is the importance of science in the production of knowledge about the movement of water under the surface. And there's a lot of struggles between different groups of people around this knowledge. And so I was interested in your projects. You already talked a little bit about this, so if you want to pass, it's okay. In terms of what forms of knowledge have become critical and what kinds of contestations have there been around these forms of expertise?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question, because when we're talking about the experimental station, it's obvious that I'm going to be speaking about the multiplicity of different scientific experts that are on the ground, from plant pathologist to hydrologist to wheat breeders, and a whole constellation of individuals that make the experiment station tick. And but everything from the person who's in the field moving the water hose to get water to a specific space, that is also an important type of knowledge and production. So I think, but there's also those sustainability scientists and fertilizer experts. And what we have is, as the knowledge, to use the example of fertilizers, has increased in terms of you don't need so much fertilizer to fertilize a plant, there's a different type of expert that is needed. And experts who, so with the farmers, this new type of relationship, how do you shift knowledge that has been working for decades and that's the expectation of the number of what the yield should be. And then you come in and you say, you don't need so much fertilizer, but you're like, well, no, we've always done this and this is the yield we need to get. How do scientists then have this conversation with farmers? And so it's right now, there's a couple of years ago, there was a scientist who came up with a handheld nitrogen sensor that would be affordable for farmers. These are commercial farmers. These are not small plot farmers. And the idea was that they themselves could see through the sensor. So science translated in their hand and their ability to see that these numbers, that they didn't need that much fertilizer to go in. It didn't work because it's very hard to move when you have a successful idea or a way of farming. So I think when it comes to these knowledge experts, you have the core, but you also have others. As we become aware of changes within scientific production, new experts have to be coming to the table and to the fore. So it's a concern of water, of soil, but it's also now of people, because we now know the contamination of the water and the contamination of the soil, what that's doing. And I'm not sure if this directly answers your question, but I think it's important. So 2 years ago, when the Mexican president gave, for the first time ever, a federal apology to the Yaqui Nation, to the Yaqui tribes, the 8 tribes, saying that they had been persecuted for so long, one of the things that they offered was to create a university in Yaqui territory. So this was, people are like, oh, that's wonderful. So I was asking, what does this mean? And they said, well, there's no infrastructure, there's no building, there are no teachers, it's just a promise. And in the promise, they told us who were the experts who are going to come, or what were the majors in this university. He said everything had Yaqui before. So it was Yaqui health, Yaqui architecture. I don't think it was architecture, but is this, and the person I was speaking to said, that only means that we can have these expertise in our territory. It doesn't mean that we can translate our knowledge to the outside world. So redefining this expertise to really reducing it to a small scale isn't providing these educational opportunities. It's again creating this limited space where they can't converse with the scientists who are just outside the Yaqui territory.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
I've been thinking a lot about like a presumed tension or opposition between indigenous knowledge and Western science. And I think a necessary or useful reframing is, it's not that they exist in opposition, but it's how they've historically been used and how Western scientific knowledge production has relied on the extraction of knowledge from indigenous communities. It's relied on indigenous, specimens to produce a certain knowledge set that does not necessarily go back to the community. So a lot of folks that I ended up working with were Dene scientists. They're trained in Western knowledge production, but they're using that knowledge to actually solve problems in their communities. So if we're thinking about cultural things like food sovereignty, how can we enact a vision of food sovereignty if our soil is contaminated, if our groundwater is contaminated by, rampant uranium mining? So it requires that knowledge. It requires hydrology and geoscience, environmental science, so that we can actually enact, restoring our crops, dry farming, So I thought that was a really, I don't know, it was revelatory because I think a lot of people can easily just put these two things in opposition, or it's like, oh, well, if you are a Dene person, but you're using these so-called colonial Western tools of science, then you're colonized, or you're not, you know, you're not practicing something traditional. And I think that that creates, you know, like a foreclosure, or you know, a moral failure for not just doing so-called indigenous farming practices. And another way I see that expressed, and I'll cite Dene hydrologist Carletta Chief, who's at the University of Arizona. She led this amazing project after the Gold King mine spill in 2015, brought together, you know, Dene hydrologists, geoscience folks, to do different biosampling, and I volunteered doing the more social science focus groups to understand perceptions of risk following this Gold King mine spill. And from that study, they determined that there were over 20 different imagined uses or relationships that Dene people had with the river. Whereas when the EPA regulated for this, for the river, and following the spill, they determined that within 2 weeks of the spill, the rivers had returned to pre-spill conditions, was based on a presumption of a recreational relationship with the river. So that has a very low, like, or very high contaminant standard, right? So that the imagined user would be someone who's in their kayak or fishing, and not someone who's using the water for like livestock, domestic purposes, or ceremonial uses. And so that I thought was, you know, really important to like see how a Dene hydrologist was using those tools, but actually to elevate, you know, Dene relationships with water. And another Dene environmental scientist that I will also highlight here is Tommy Rock, and he's the one that I'm working with to do these water samples. So I absolutely think that using these tools is about, you know, restoring our own, you know, Dene livelihoods and food sovereignty, but in ways that are not extractive, but ways for us to actually live on our homelands without fear of contamination.
Yeah, no. Oh. But the way that I've been thinking about it, and this conversation has been very helpful, is, you know, the ecological science in South Korea that I was engaging with. It's really fascinating because, you know, the first generation of ecologists in natural scientists in South Korea were schooled during the Japanese occupation, and a lot of them went to Japanese universities, got their PhDs there, and after World War II, the US came in, and one of the first studies of the DMZ's ecology was organized by the Smithsonian Institution in collaboration with these South Korean scientists. But as with a lot of kind of US imperial knowledge projects, when it comes to ecologies, when they encountered these South Koreans, they were viewed as overly interested, meaning they were too nationalistic, right? So their science was not scientific enough. And, you know, I think Celia Lowe talks about this in the context of Indonesia, right? This kind of post-colonial science. And in a way, though, for the South Koreans, it was really a decolonial science. But it couldn't be recognized as such, right? Because they were seen as framing too many of their inquiries around, like it was always framed, the data was framed within a larger narrative of nation building. And what I find interesting to think with is this question of, you know, for a lot of Korean studies folks, you know, and anthropologists, we have an allergic reaction to nationalism. Particularly when it's very like androcentric and masculinist. But on the other hand, like we are in a decolonial moment. So I find it interesting to think about, you know, the ways in which certain kinds of knowledge projects become kind of inherently devalued and end up aligning with a very kind of US-centric imperial project, you know? And so we almost never think of Koreans as indigenous, right? But they were formerly colonized, right? So what does it mean to produce knowledge in that context where there's so much at stake in producing knowledge about the natural world, you know, in a Korean sense? And so that's kind of what this whole conversation is bringing up for me. And, you know, to give a little bit more granularity to what we mean about post-colonial or nationalist or decolonial in given context where so much has been already framed around, you know, a certain kind of scientific knowledge that is so deeply embedded in these imperial rationalities. So.
I really appreciate the way in which your three answers take us away from the word that I used for the question, which is the notion of conflicts of knowledge. I really want to underscore that, how you take us in a much more interesting direction by asking about, by thinking about the uses of knowledge as a key question here, rather than the essence that you might imagine is behind a notion of conflict or controversies or a bunch of these concepts that are very familiar to us. So I really appreciate that. I have one last question, and after that we'll open it up to others. And this last question is a little bit about, if you want to call it, methodology. So this semester, the ethnography studio members followed what we might call a specific format of collaboration. We came together late in the fall and collectively developed a concept that we wanted to explore, and that's the Porosities concept, and that's on the website if you're curious to see what we came up with. Just one paragraph that set the foundation. So we produced that short write-up, and then each studio member explored that concept from the point of view of their own research project. We conceived of this process as a type of collaboration, a form of co-thinking that is not organized around a shared project, but makes a serious commitment to give one's time and ideas to other people's projects. So I'm curious if you could share some of the ideas or collaborative practices that you find most generative in your research, in your teaching, or in any other dimension of your life, in your engagements with the people that you work with. And more broadly, I wanted to ask if collaboration is a term or a concept that is meaningful to you, that you go to, and if not, because there are many other concepts that one could use, what would be that other form of thinking about working with others at any particular moment in the research process? And importantly, to go beyond the myth of the individual and decontextualized researcher. So, was that a hand? Yes. I guess, you know, I think of ethnography as always collaborative. But I think that in my own projects, I think almost all of them are technically collaborations now. Mostly in terms of co-authoring and I guess co-thinking, but I think those two things don't necessarily go together all the time, right? You can co-think but not co-author. I think co-authoring is really hard, but in any case, but it's really can be extremely productive too. But the only thing I would say to contribute to this conversation is I've become increasingly interested in affect in knowledge production. And we talk about affect often like, you know, as a theoretical frame that's been sort of au courant recently, but I'm really interested in the sort of relations of power and vulnerability in knowledge production that I think, you know, comes out sometimes in the writing of ethnography, but is such a key part of how anthropologists go out into the world, because it is a process of making ourselves vulnerable to a certain extent, but we often just focus on like the relative privilege that we have to produce knowledge. So, but I think that is a really affectively charged set of relationships that, you know, kind of inform the collaboration.
inherently, but there's not enough kind of, you know, I mean, some people have written about all of the various aspects of the research encounter, but that's one thing that I've become really interested in. And then the last thing I'll just say is I think of mentorship as collaboration. It may not be like the most equal one, but it is a lifelong commitment. And you know, the terms of that collaboration do shift over time. So that's been interesting to kind of witness in my own life.
I don't know if I have a better term for collaboration. Maybe that's just a good placeholder. I mean, I wrote critically about the term collaboration in my master's thesis, and that was like looking in museum spaces, because museums were very overly celebratory of collaboration. And I think sometimes that happens in academia as well. Because like, what does it mean to have a collaborator? Is it like co-authorship, or even in media production? Is it co-editing, you know? And it is really hard to, I think, have a truly collaborative relationship or partnership. In terms of my own work, I've been co-authoring a lot. I don't know if I would call that collaboration, but it's definitely been co-thinking, and it's been very generative for me. It's pushed me beyond my own intellectual assumptions. You know, I co-authored a piece with a Dene epidemiologist a couple of years ago, and that was really amazing because I'm not trained in epidemiology or public health, but all of the concerns around contamination obviously begged these questions around public health. And so it was an invitation for me to dig deeper into that framework and then to bring some of the concepts from my own work as a social scientist into thinking about epidemiological questions and vice versa. I think my most truly collaborative partnerships have been in the museum work. In writing the text panels for the two cases that I worked on for the Field Museum exhibit, and I went back home and I interviewed artists and transcribed those interviews. And then I worked with a museum staff to summarize some of the stories that my interlocutors or collaborators shared with me. And then we brought it back to them to make sure that was true to what they were trying to say. And that was a constant negotiation, because from the museum, they're like 70-word text panels, that's it. So how do you distill, like an hour-long interview to 70 words? And it's already, I think, a challenge enough when we're trying to write, 7,000 words or something, but to do 70 words was quite another challenge. So I think that was a really interesting process for me, because it was constantly going back and forth to make sure that I was being faithful, because this is a permanent exhibit, right? And because so many people were going to see it, I was very worried, like, okay, we don't want to like misrepresent like what your quotes are. And we had to have a very definitive text that was translated into Spanish, and then was also translated into the Navajo language. So if you go to the museum, there's touch panels and you can translate it into the different languages. And I thought that was, such an amazing process, because I have not yet published in other languages. So maybe this was my first foray into like translating beyond, English texts that I've done predominantly with my scholarship.
So this was another question that I really loved. And the reason I loved it is because I think that we need change in academia. So much of what we do is based on this individual trajectory to get tenure, right? And that in so many ways limits our creativity, because it's about the single authorship. I mean, at least in history, it's about the single authored book, the monograph. And in some ways, I really think that restricts collaboration that could begin earlier. I mean, it's really remarkable that you're doing this as a junior scholar. For myself, I really started collaborative work that I'm going to be talking about now much later, once I had secured tenure. And also that has shifted because now I'm in an institution that I'm tenured at Harvard, which gives me a freedom that I didn't feel I had as a junior scholar, to be able to take risks in collaboration. How was that going to translate to potential tenure writers? So I'm saying that because when I'm going to talk about collaborations, sounds wonderful, but it's also about where you are located in your individual institution, and funding is so important. So I love what I do, and funding allows me to do a lot of this. So for example, collaboration for me in teaching, I've been able in the last couple of years to co-teach with colleagues from MIT because it's just down the road, and we create a seminar, and that is so enriching because MIT students are so different from Harvard students, and to just bring these grad students into conversation to see how they're reading text differently is just really fruitful for me. So I think co-teaching has been a wonderful experience. Also, when I arrived, before I was previously, I was at UC Santa Barbara, and there was a writing group that had been started there. So I started a writing group in the department where every Friday for 4 hours, the seminar room was open, and I asked the dean for fun. She's like, sure. So it was, people come when there's food. So we would have coffee and pastries. And this was wonderful because it was colleagues. We were also busy, and people could stop by for 30 minutes or for the full 4 hours. Everyone was silent on their laptops, but occasionally it'd be like, hey, have you heard of this grant? Or a junior person saying, you know, I've got this question. And it created this really wonderful space. The pandemic did away with that. And we haven't been able to rebuild because the comfort of our home is now, I also, you know, I like my home and being there and working from there. But I think that's a different way of collaboration, of bringing people together. Co-writing, I agree with you, it's difficult, but it creates a different way of thinking. I co-wrote this article with Marisa Lasso, who writes on the Panama Canal, and her book Erasure, which is about the people who were erased, who lived in the spaces where the canal were built. So I was writing about irrigation canals, and she's writing about the Panama Canal. And I thought it would be a really interesting way to write, and that was really fruitful. I'll just say two more things about collaborative work that I think is really important. And so actually, I'll just take my time to say one thing. When I arrived at Harvard, one thing that I really missed about Santa Barbara was having the close friendships with other female colleagues. And knowing that female colleagues, it's like having a different academia, a different academic space. So what I started doing that unfortunately also fell away with the pandemic was every month I would invite random female academics, junior and senior, from across the campus, from the sciences, from the social sciences, from the humanities, to a dinner where there would be plenty of wine. And everyone was told that they could not talk about work. We could just talk about ourselves, which is really important because I love my job and I'm a workaholic and I love it. But social relations, that's collaboration. Social relations and fostering these from the get-go are really important. And it's different when you're in different stages of your academic career. But I can't emphasize enough how important it is, and not just females, males and others, it's really important to forge these relationships. But it's a way that we need to begin to think of what an academic space is and what it can be. And it's starting with these really strong social relations that then go into collaborations or other ways of, or else you remain within your space and your discipline. So I think to create more energy and more excitement within academia.
Thank you. I appreciate the question of responsibility with our collaborators, either through mentorship or other kinds of collaborations across publics, and this more interpersonal dimension of it. And particularly, I appreciate how you brought teaching into the equation, because we don't talk so much about teaching. So we have about 9 minutes. Now it's time for questions from the audience here, or questions from our Zoom colleagues, whom we see are on our backs here. Or comments. Yes.
I have one question.
Yeah, please speak loudly.
So, I have one question to Professor Liliana. Because I think I'm not an expert or knowledgeable enough about the case of Korea, but I have been feeling all time that the state or the case of borders in Korea is very different and unique and almost like.
You have to speak loudly
Okay,
because
so
people can't hear you in the back.
the state of borders in Korea, it's quite different and has its own special history. And the emphasis on land borders. It's for me quite troubling when I think about the ballistic rockets and the nuclear ballistic rockets from North Korea. Like what is the meaning of the on land borders when you easily doesn't have any meaning with the real conflict. If there is a real war, it will not have any meaning. It will not keep anything. So I was really curious to know more about that. What do you think about that in this condition? Like, what is the meaning of the on land borders when we have this situation with any real threat? These borders will be meaningless.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, I mean, I mean, in a way, I mean, all borders are like that, right? I mean, you know, air warfare is rampant, but I guess, yeah, Korea has a very specific history. I mean, one thing to know about it is that it's not, the DMZ isn't referred to as the border by either side because it's not recognized as a legitimate national border. It's a division line that represents, you know, a decision by the superpowers at the end of World War II. And so both North Korea and South Korea, both states consider the entire peninsula to be their legitimate territory. So, so there's that. And then regarding the terrestrial versus, you know, other kinds of invasion strategies or techniques, yes, certainly. And it's an interesting thing with the landmines, for instance, because, you know, one rationale, and I talk about this in other places, but, you know, the international campaign to ban landmines has been incredibly successful. It's, you know, has like almost all nations on the world are signatories except for the United States, Russia, South Korea, North Korea, and a few others. And for the US, the rationale for not signing that mine ban treaty is what they call the Korea exception. Because they say in the case of a war on the Korean Peninsula, landmines will be important as a kind of defense. Of course, we all know, you know, an air invasion is much more likely than a terrestrial one. And yet it's used as this kind of rationale to maintain certain kinds of military infrastructure and you know, to kind of maintain a certain level of terror, to be frank. So, you know, there are many things. So, you know, the military folks might say, well, if the North Koreans, you know, bring tanks over, we need those anti-tank mines, et cetera. You know, you talk to military professionals and tanks are like completely like prehistoric technology, especially in a situation like Korea. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to critique the particularities of the military situation in Korea. But, you know, I think any situation where there's a border dispute or, you know, enmity between neighboring states, you know, it's, yeah, I think you'd find something similar. Okay. Any questions from the room? No. I have another question. And since we have just a couple of minutes, maybe about what comes next. For each of you, what do you see happening in terms of your research in the immediate future?
The immediate future, I really need to finish this book. And that is what comes next. Yeah. Writing that last chapter in the conclusion. And being able to move on to a project that takes on a different discipline that will challenge me to learn new ways of thinking and new ways of engaging with the material that I thought I knew at a different level.
Finishing my first book, not getting distracted by writing all these other things. No, I'm really trying to write something that, well, this is for my late grandfather, who's the one that taught me a lot of these stories. He also worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he worked in the Real Property Management Office. So it is actually quite interesting that I would grow up to become very interested in questions of like land status in the Navajo Nation, given the fact that that's literally what his job was. Yeah, I want to write something that's true to the stories that he told me, and trying to really prioritize oral history. And so I think the task for me has been kind of taking some of the theory out of the dissertation and trying to let stories do a lot more of the conceptual work with the manuscript, and then trying to put the theory into articles. And that's the balance that I've been trying to strike in my own work. In terms of the second project that I've started is around the Colorado River. So I grew up in Western Colorado, and now with all of these crisis narratives about Colorado River governance, I'm increasingly seeing that work as a way to take my concerns in the Navajo Nation and the Colorado Plateau and to actually think broadly across the entire West, and also foregrounding Indigenous relationships with water and land. So I'm excited. And with all of my projects, since I was originally a photographer, I like to start by doing photo essays, and that's a way for me to kind of like test the waters and to start trying to develop analytics. So I'm in that photo essay stage for the Colorado River project, which is fun.
Oh my gosh, I've been telling people since I finished my book, I'm like, I have a lot of irons and very lukewarm ovens right now. So I can say a few, there's one project that I have my heart in is kind of doing experimental oral histories with my father, who grew up during the Japanese occupation, lived through the war, was a migrant to the US, and also thinking kind of almost in a global history way about the role of South Korea's development in what we now think of as like the Anthropocene, as a developing nation that basically became the chemical cesspool for like the global economy, and the source of all this cheap labor, and at a particular moment in time in the 1970s. So that's kind of two things. There's like three others that are just, the smell one.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our guests. To all of you for being here, and to all of our friends via Zoom, and stay tuned for the next Ethnography Studio event. You're always all welcome. Have a good afternoon.